Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode of Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts, and part 2 of our sad story, Eugenia Falleni, Harry, trapped inside the wrong body. We left off from part 1, Eugenia, or Harry, as he really was deep down, living as a man. He'd been through some turmoil with the family, not accepting him for who he was. So he left, as well as getting into a terrible situation on a Norwegian bark where he was working with other seamen and a captain took advantage. The fact that his body was one of a woman's and left him stranded in Newcastle with very little money and a pregnancy he did not want. Luckily, he knew of a family in Sydney, the DeAngelis family, and they assisted with him giving birth to Josephine. Mrs. DeAngelis would raise Josephine. Harry then began life, living it as a man how he always wanted to, and meets Annie and starts a new life married with her and her child from a previous relationship, Harry Jr. But we know it doesn't end well for Eugenia or Harry, and this is where things start to decline. From the outset, everything looked perfect, but it wasn't. The area in which they lived, Balmain, was one of high crime at this time, as well as the relationship between Harry and Harry Jr. was strained, as well as the fact that Annie was getting a little sick and tired of their monotonous sexual relationship. She found it odd that they would do the same thing all the time, and when she instigated intimacy, it was often met with, "Women don't instigate." He had to be the one to get the ball rolling, so to speak, and that was only because his device was hidden and he had to carefully plan out each intimate moment with the device. Sadly too was the divorce or separation of the DeAngelis family. Mr. DeAngelis had threatened his wife on many occasions that he was going to leave and go home to Italy because he grew very jealous of the relationship that Mrs. DeAngelis had with Josephine over the years. And eventually in 1914, when Josephine was now a teenager, he left. And it must have been too much for Mrs. DeAngelis because Josephine became pregnant. She'd been going out late at night and had gotten herself in trouble with a man. Just like her mother, Harry, she found herself in the similar predicament. And then the worst thing happened to Josephine. Mrs. DeAngelis died suddenly of dropsy. And to make matters worse, the will that Mrs. DeAngelis had was unsigned, and her entire estate went to a distant relative, leaving Josephine with nothing. She found herself pregnant and alone, just like her mother had. Harry took control of the situation and found a place where Josephine could have her baby. Josephine had her baby at St Margaret's Maternity Home in Burke Street, Darlinghurst, in September of 1914. Shortly after the birth of her daughter, the baby suffered a heart attack and died at the age of 3 months. Josephine was heartbroken and blamed herself for the tragedy. Harry had to take care of Josephine at this time, and he brought Josephine to live with he and Annie and Harry Jr. But Annie knew nothing of Josephine. Harry told Annie that Josephine was his daughter, but that the mother had only been a brief relationship he'd had many years earlier, and that he'd not even known that the mother had died recently, only that Josephine had contacted him. When Annie would ask Josephine much about the mother, Josephine wouldn't say anything, and Annie just presumed that the whole ordeal had traumatised her. After Josephine moved in with the little family, everything fell apart. The happy dynamic that there once was gone. Harry began drinking. Josephine and Annie got into many fights as Annie tried to keep Josephine indoors, but all she wanted to do was drink and hang out with sailors. She was devastated at the loss of her baby and couldn't be controlled. Poor Harry Jr. was lost amongst all of it, and everything went downhill. The business went under as well, and in the end, Annie sold it, and her and Harry Jr. moved away. They first moved in with the sister at Cogra, and then into another little place, where Harry followed her. And soon they all were under the same roof again, and this just created the beginning of the end. Harry Jr. had been attending a public school in Drummoyne. At the age of 14, he left for full-time employment at a grocery store. Harry secured a job at the Riverston Meat Works for himself and Josephine. Living in the house was awful, and after a particularly rough fight between Josephine and Harry, her father, mother, she went next door and spent some time with a friend who was of around the same age. The friend's mother had often, when she'd come over, asked her about her mother, and this pestered Josephine because the woman was relentless and wouldn't give up. And on this occasion, as mad as she was, she stated, "My mother is next door wearing man's clothing. That's my mother." She immediately regretted saying this, but the woman held on to it for weeks and weeks, stewing over what she would do with this information. Josephine had thought the woman had forgotten, but she hadn't, and she went next door when she knew Annie was alone. After weeks of sizing up Harry and confirming it for herself that Harry was a woman, she approached Annie and told her everything, that Josephine had said it and she believed it. Annie discarded the comments straight away. How on earth could she be living with a woman? That just couldn't happen. And she dismissed the woman and made her leave, but then thought about it and began to believe it. It all makes sense now to Annie, why Harry was so modest and wouldn't let her get intimate and touchy-feely, so to speak. She made up her mind she was going to tell Harry that she knew, and one afternoon when he came home from work, she did this, while Josephine was out and Harry was busy. They had a terrible fight about it, but neither of them were willing to let the information get out. They couldn't. It was scandalous, not just for Harry, who knows what would happen to him. Getting locked up again and in maybe a men's jail, he was very fearful. And Annie, what scandal! Her sister would be proven right, and she couldn't let that happen either. They had to think of some way of ending it. Well, Annie wanted to end it. Harry didn't want to end it. So for the next 8 months, Annie sat on it, wondering what she could do, trying to think of any way out of this marriage without all the scandal. And Harry, well, he just accepted things as they were and was quite happy with it. She wasn't saying anything, she was staying, as far as he was aware. And for 8 months, it all settled down. Harry Jr. was working a lot and avoiding the house and the uncomfortable environment, spending much of his time with the grocery store owners and their family. Josephine moved out as well after she let slip the terrible secret and knew that the reason they were all fighting was because of it. The couple grew very distant over the next 8 months until Annie decided something had to be done. She spoke to Harry and said they needed to talk, and they both decided that going for a picnic at the Lane Cove Park was what they should do, to talk it out on mutual ground. After all, it was where they decided to get married. Neither knew what was about to go down. Harry decided in his mind that they were going to rekindle. Perhaps Annie had decided that she wanted to stay and that everything was going to be okay. It wasn't. Annie was going to do the opposite. She'd already set herself up for Harry Jr. and her to move out, and she was going to get an annulment or divorce, but on the grounds that she wasn't happy in the marriage due to not being able to be content in the bedroom. And he came up with a story that Harry confessed on their wedding night that he had a daughter, Josephine, and Annie, hearing these lies, couldn't from then on become intimate with Harry. And this is the grounds where they will divorce, on the fact that they couldn't become intimate and they just didn't have a marriage worth keeping, I guess. This must have been a way out of a marriage back in these days. If there wasn't a child produced from a relationship, they may have been able to get an annulment. They'd been married a couple of years now, so it seems a bit strange, but we'll go with it. What happened that day at Lane Cove Park, no one will ever really know, but it goes down in history as a very curious case. Only one of them left that park that day. Harry. Somewhere amongst having the picnic, it is believed that he murdered Annie, or at least he was found guilty of it. He still, to the end, declared that he never murdered her. But we'll never really know what happened. It would only ever be Harry's version of events that came to light. Many people have speculated what possibly did happen, but Harry's version of events went that they were drinking and arguing, and when Annie got up to leave, he grabbed hold of her, which, in her struggling to get away from him, she fell, hitting her head fatally. She bled out against a tree, and fearful of what would come next, Harry lit a fire and burned the remains. However, he didn't burn everything, and eventually it would come to light who the murder victim in the park years later was. Initially, after the park, Harry fled home. Even though he told Harry Jr. that his mum had run off with another man, Harry Jr. was always sceptical of this. Why would she leave Harry Jr. behind? Straight away, Harry sold the house, and he and Harry Jr. lived for a time in a boarding place where Harry chewed around whether or not he was going to kill the boy. How could he leave Harry Jr. motherless? It's a whirlwind from here. Harry takes Harry Jr. to live with an old Italian woman that knew him from back in the old days, but knew he was a woman. She only spoke Italian, so Harry figured she wasn't going to tell Harry Jr. the truth, and that Harry Jr. would only stay there for a year or two before making his own way in the world. So he left Harry Jr. with this woman. This would backfire for him, as only 2 years later it would come to light to Harry what had happened. The lady's son would expose Harry for who he was, telling Harry Jr. that Harry was actually Nina. His mother had been calling him Nina in Italian the whole time, but Harry Jr. hadn't noticed or understood. But her son confirmed it for him, and Harry Jr. freaked out. He went to his Aunt Lily at Cogra, who he hadn't had anything to do with for years since his mother and Harry got married, and Lily became distant. Lily remembers back to a conversation that Annie had with her the last time they spoke. Annie had said Harry wasn't a man, but Lily brushed it off, thinking she must have just thought he was less of a man because he wasn't strong and tall like other men, or perhaps even she thought that he was homosexual. But they went to the police to find out what had happened to the mother, and they had no idea because nobody had said Annie was missing. Nobody had reported her 2 years before. So thus begins the search for Harry. It had been 2 years since he left Harry Jr. with the woman, and he'd made a new life for himself. He met a woman named Lizzie while working at a hotel. They fell in love and got married, and he was content for the first time in his life. All that was about to change. The police arrested him at his workplace and hauled him in for questioning. This was the beginning of the end for Harry. The trial was agonising for Harry and all that were involved. They had a strong case, but it wasn't a strong case for murder, as they couldn't really prove that Harry had killed Annie. However, there was no doubt in the jury's mind. They'd made up how they felt about Harry. A woman posing as a man. It's an abomination. So they found him guilty, and he went to jail. Originally guilty and sentenced to death, it was commuted to life in prison. Harry spent 11 years in prison with women. He couldn't have been put with men. Well, it's clearly obvious why. But after 11 years and an appeal, he was released, taking the name Gene Ford and trying to live a normal life. Well, as normal as it could be for a woman who dresses as a man in the society that they had. He couldn't be known as Harry Crawford anymore, and tried to change his appearance as much as possible so he wouldn't be recognised. He started a boarding house of his own, buying and selling, and on the day he died, had made a lot of money, £100. But he did die, not in an elderly way, but a rather tragic way. He stepped out onto Oxford Street and was hit by a car, and sadly, the person who was identifying him was actually the person who jailed him and knew straight away who he was. Once again, the headlines hit the papers. The man-woman is dead. Eugenia Falleni is gone. The newspapers reached the family back in New Zealand, and one of the wives of Harry's younger brothers is stated as saying that the mother read the paper and was relieved. She was sad but relieved. The whole family were relieved that they weren't going to have Eugenia turn up on their doorstep with some crazy thing going on. They would have had to have lived through the trial and Harry going to jail and things like that, so they were relieved that he was gone. However, only days after Harry died, his father Luigi died. And only weeks after Luigi died, Isola died. Harry's mother and father died within a month of his death. How strange. Perhaps now that he was gone, they could finally rest. And being hit by a car, was this just a freak accident? Or perhaps did Annie push him from beyond the grave? Yes, I know that's very far-fetched. But, hey, had he been totally innocent, perhaps he would have lived a very long life. Karma may have bit him and taken him in the end. But it's only speculation. Nobody knows for sure. But Harry did go to the grave, declaring his innocence for killing Annie. And it is believed that he really loved her. He wanted a life with Annie. He didn't want to be without her. Could he have killed her? Or was it just a freak accident, like so many in this story? Well, we hope you have a wonderful Halloween, and hope that you enjoyed the story of Eugenia Falleni. A very tragic story, and in the future we aim to go into the areas where these people we talk about lived and worked and were, in the hope we may be able to contact the residual energy that they have, if any at all. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and keep tuning in because we've got many more stories to tell.